Hello, this is Pastor Ed, and we're continuing on in our study in John. We're in chapter 7 today, and we're going to be looking at verses 1 through 53, a rather long passage. And I wanted to start given a verse in Luke chapter 2 and verse 52, and it says, "And Jesus increased in wisdom and stature and in favor with God and with man." So we see in chapters 1 through 6 of John where Jesus is in favor with man, and people are starting to learn who he is, and they really like him. They're starting to follow him. And then we reach chapter 7 of John, and from this time forward through the rest of the scriptures, we're going to see a major change take place. So it's right here in chapter 7 where this change takes place, and we see people starting to view Jesus with hatred and animosity, and it escalates. And so from this time on, they're looking at ways to plot to put Jesus to death. And when we get to chapter 11, we're going to read more on this, and it's going to become more clear. So as opposed to chapter 252 in Luke, where we see Jesus is esteemed and he's well favored by God and by man. Now, does he ever lose that favor with God? No, but he loses it with man, doesn't he? Jesus has been in Galilee. We talked about how Micah was talking about how Jews would avoid the Samaritan way, and they would travel across the sea and totally go around to travel to Galilee. And then when they came back to Jerusalem, they would have to travel that same way. So instead of going the Samaritan way, which is the way Jesus chose to go up to Galilee. But now he's in Galilee and he's wanting to go back to Jerusalem. And the Jewish leaders have been eyeing him, and they've heard reports about him. And even though he's done all of these miracles and the great things that he's done in their cities and in their midst, they're still plotting on how they could put Jesus to death. Between chapter 6 and chapter 7, there is a pause. There's a gap that takes place, and this pause is about 6 months long. And it's not that Jesus has taken 6 months off, he's taken a long vacation. It's that Jesus doesn't record the events that are taking place during this time that are recorded in the synoptic gospels, the gospel of Matthew, Mark, and Luke, that all go together and they tell the same story all through the whole Matthew, Mark, and Luke. So John has his own story to tell, and John's telling this story, and he doesn't include these events that take place. What's taken place during chapter 7 is the Feast of the Tabernacles, and that's what I want to focus on today. This feast takes place in the fall of the year, late September, early October, and it's a festival that's a festival of great joy. It's a festival that the Jews considered their most significant of all of their festivals. They had 3 festivals that they called pilgrimage or pilgrim festivals. And we could talk about those. One of them was called the Feast of the Passover. One of them was the Feast of Pentecost, and one of them was the Feast of Tabernacles, also called the Feast of Booths or tents or shacks, lean-tos. What they would do is they would build these. They would have to actually leave Jerusalem and travel 3 times a year to celebrate these feasts. So they would go out of the city, and so they would take their children with them, and they would set up these tents or lean-tos, and they would spend 8 days out celebrating this Feast of Tabernacles. And it was a feast to celebrate what God did in the Passover, what God did in leading the children of Israel out of bondage. And so God provided for them. God provided manna. God provided water. Even when they didn't have any water, even when they didn't have any food, God provided. God provided food. God provided water. And so this is an 8-day feast that's celebrating God's provision. And it was a time for kids to dance around and look up at the stars at night and look at the moon and be out there with their families during the day in the sunshine. And we can basically divide chapter 7 into 3 parts. Verses 1 through 10 would be before the feast. Verses 11 through 39 would be during the feast. And verses 40 through 53 would be after the feast. And during this whole time, we kind of see a response that we see in the people and their response to Jesus. One of their responses is a response of disbelief. They don't believe that he is who he says he is. They don't believe that he's a master or a rabbi or the Christ or the Messiah. They have a hard time believing that even these miracles he's performed, that until they actually see him or somebody that they trust has actually told him of these things, even his own brothers, as we read in this passage, are going to disbelieve. Now, these are half brothers. Jesus has several brothers and he has sisters. We see in Matthew 13:55 where he lists his brothers and he mentions his sisters in there. And then we don't only see this disbelief as a response, but we also see a response of debate. And this debate has taken place, and it's mostly between Pharisees and Sadducees and the high council, and they're trying to figure out what they can do, how they can plot to actually put him to death. And there's also a response of division. There are those that believe, there's more coming to believe, but there's more that don't believe. So we see these three responses. As we travel through this chapter, some other names are mentioned. We see James mentioned. This is the James that we learn of in Acts that actually becomes the pastor of the church of Jerusalem. Then we see Jonas mentioned, and we see Simon mentioned. This isn't Simon Peter. This is another Simon, and we see Judas mentioned, and this isn't Judas Iscariot. This is the Judas that actually wrote the book of Jude, and he's traveling with Jesus. It's hard to reach your own family. It's hard to reach the people in the city that you're from. Even during this passage, we see they're questioning where he's from. Is he from Galilee? Is he from Nazareth? No good came from anybody from Galilee. Well, Jesus wasn't from that, but they still don't know. So we see these questions being raised. Okay, I'd encourage you to continue to read the prayer requests on the bottom of your John booklet and write your notes down. Read through the book of John, chapter 7 today, and thank you for being with me.